A deal on Dickens, who could resist? A stack of Austen, warmly kissed. Golden Age crime tales twist and turn, every page a treasure to learn. Books keep coming home with me, piles so tall they're all I see. Turn a page and sail the sea, reading always feels so free.
Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. I'm actually really in a kind of peppy mood for doing some videos. I just finished a two-parter for a challenge about craft books on your shelves. And I'm like, you know what? I just kind of feel like keeping on. So I'm doing that. I'll probably pay for it tomorrow, but I'm keeping on. So this is one of the first books that I finished this year for quarter one. I think the first one might have actually been the one on the crucifixion, that reddish book. I haven't posted that review yet. It should be going up pretty soon if it's not up already. And by the time this video is up, it'll be up because I tend to post my reviews in order. But this is women's work. I actually started it last year in 2024, but I didn't get to finish it because I started too late in the quarter one for Historathon. So I was like, oh, I'll just finish it next year. I started off, I think, actually audiobook, and then I moved over to physical. And every once in a while I'd flip back and forth, but I ended up doing this year, completely reading physically. Because I think I got actually the physical book fairly late in the game. I mean, you can see where I don't even start highlighting and writing notes right away in here. Although I didn't start doing tabbing until much later last year. This was a very enjoyable book. I don't leave, but the author begins talking about the fact that she's a weaver and how this led her on a journey. And I do have her other book that she wrote prior to this one that talks about ancient textiles and shows a bunch of like pictures of ancient textiles. I do intend to read that one at some point. But this is her historical deep dive into different cultures in antiquity and women's work during that time period, usually when it regarding cloth work. But that will include things like dyeing and also how they would gather the dyes, the kind of things they would use for dyes, how they would set the dyes, like setting, and I think it was ancient Greece where they would set out the jars in the street where people could just go and like urinate in your jar, and they'd be like, okay, great, we have a way to set our dye now, our acid, because even now you set dyes in yarn with an acid. I think my mom uses citric acid. So yeah, that's something that they did in antiquity, is they would use urine or whatever, because otherwise, before they did that, the colors wouldn't stay necessarily because they didn't have anything to force them to stay. And so they talk about different, here's, I think, ancient Greek using a drop spindle. And I have do I still have the drop spindle? I don't use it anymore. I wasn't very good at spinning. It took time away from my knitting. If I had stuck to it, maybe. Also, I couldn't figure out how to ply the yarn, which that's when initially when you make a thread, it's just going to be, you're taking it from your fluff and you end up making it into string. And usually it's going to be a single strand of string, as thicker as, thin as you're skilled to make it, because at the beginning you're going to be very thick and thin. But what they'll usually do to make it stronger is they'll ply several strands together. And I know I've done this before where I've destroyed some yarn to show you some ply. Well, this is acrylic, but you can still see ply work on this if I can find an end. Okay, I know you have an end here somewhere. You are not the yarn with no end. And I don't feel, oh, you know what I have? I must have been using this to hold stitches because this is actually wool instead of acrylic. So, first of all, if you look really closely, you can see where, and I know I've done this before, there are multiple strands. So someone, if this was something that was hand spun, which this probably wasn't, but if it had been hand spun, that would mean that each one of these would have been spun separately. Okay, so it would mean that if this was hand spun, which this was not most likely, each one of these would have been spun separately, and then they would have had to be spun together into a twist, which I never perfected that. And that's how you would get this stronger strand of yarn. Now, there are projects that work with just a single strand, but it doesn't tend to be quite as strong a yarn. But anyway, that they had to figure out how to do stranding and things like that. But they talk about, at one point in history, the people got to a point where, okay, we're able to settle a little bit. Now we can think about raising animals for wool, so we can actually start making clothes in that way. Now, they might have done some with, I want to say early in the book they talk about where they might have done plant fibers. But I can't remember. It's been too long since I've read the beginning of the book. But you can use plant fibers. I haven't used them a ton myself, but like you'll see bamboo, for example. And other ones. Oh, trying to remember some of the other. Bamboo's the one that immediately comes to mind. I know there's others. But this goes through and shows some classic ones. I know they have a picture in here of what's considered to be the oldest garment. And it actually has, I want to say it had some shaping. It had some decorative design on the bottom. It was really nice. But that was like the first garment that they actually were able to find in decent enough shape, considering how old it was, in Egypt. Now, in Egypt, they talk about how they usually tended to use linen instead, which doesn't dye as well as wool. So that's why a lot of their garments did tend to be white. It was just easier in general and cooler. A lot of times they put beads over the white actual garment. So then all you'd have to do is really change the beadwork for a completely different outfit. And they discuss that in here as well. They do talk a little bit about the face makeup, how that has its usage. So it covers the work of the women, which is talking about all the different ways to create the fabric, then make the garments going on from there. But so there's huge, a lot of the sections are about weaving, because weaving was such a huge part of women's work, spinning and weaving, for many, many years. I mean, they talk about, somewhere in here, they talk about how when you read the Bible, they talk about how the soldiers were casting lots in order to have who would have Jesus' tunic, because it was without seam. It talks about how Mary would have created a garment without seam that they would want to cast lots for that. And they talk about just the different kinds of garments that people would have made in different cultures, how they would have made. They use the Bible as a source quite a few times to point at why things were a certain way and how this points to how this culture would have made garments at that period of time. They talk about how, I want to say it was when they were going to take down Jericho, and the guys got taken in by, I want to say she was either a prostitute, I can't remember her name, which is why, she took them in, and when they were hiding among I believe the term, they said it was she had stuff drying on the roof. Oh no, it wasn't drying on the rooftop. I'm sorry. It was supposed to be gathering the dew on the rooftop, because when you are spinning linen, it needs to stay damp because it won't stick to itself otherwise. It needs to be wet to do that. And so they would leave, I keep wanting to say it's flax, and I'm not sure if that's correct or not, because I've not worked with linen in that way. But they would, I want to say it was flax, laid it out on the rooftop, and then it would a lot of times they would gather the dew overnight, and then they would be able to work with it that way. And you would also get rid of a lot of the extra stuff from it that you couldn't work with. And I'm not being very helpful in how I describe that, because my memory is not helping me right now. But maybe that'll actually encourage you to read this book, because there's a lot in here. Some really cool stuff that some of it just even like explains. Oh, here we go. To obtain fibers from the dried flax, one has to keep it wet or damp just long enough to rot the fleshy part of the stem away from the tough, usable fibers. The necessary process called retting. Okay, this necessary process is called retting. Women in nearby Palestine spread their flax out in great quantity on the fields or flat rooftops and retted it from the dampness of the nightly dew, as we learn from the cloak and dagger scene in the Old Testament. But she, Rahab, had brought the fugitives up to the roof of the house and hid them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order upon the roof. So yes, okay, I did remember correctly about being flax. But yeah, there were two things. You wanted to get rid of the fleshy part, but also it worked best if, even when you were spinning it, they actually had a bowl they would keep it in to keep it damp while they were working with it. So yes, a lot of interesting stuff in here. Just even talk about how the women, how they were business women, how they would send their wares with the men when they would be going distances to quite a ways to sell their wares and to buy wares. The women would send them with this lovely work and then be like, hey, I need this, that, and the other thing. I'm sending this much cloth with you. Please set aside a part of these profits for that, because not only do we need it to pay off certain debts, but I need this to continue the work. So it was really cool, because you actually have some existing communication between husbands and their wives, or their sister, or men and their sisters, who were trying to figure out what the women needed to continue to run their business that they were outside of their homes, which is a kind of cool aspect you don't really think about with antiquity, of these women being able to be businesswomen of a sort. And they do talk about there's just so much different ways that people would weave in different cultures, what you can tell about the way cloth was made based off of old statues and stuff. What, like, if you look close, if you are educated in fiber crafts, how you can look at it and be like, oh, hey, I can see how that was made. And that's actually how she started, is she would look at things like, hey, I think I know how that was made. And she kind of got like brushed off a little bit. And she's like, you know what? I'm going to look into it myself. And she wrote 2 books. I'm not sure if she has more than the 2. But this was a really interesting. I'm going to have to reread it at some point. Particularly the first part, where I think there's less that I remember from it, because I was flipping back and forth. I didn't have the book at first. I think I tried doing it on Kindle first. That was a mistake. It's much better to have physical form. And even if you're not a fiber artist, I think this is just an excellent book to have. It's so interesting. Even if you are someone who whether you are just interested in women's history in general, interested in economic history, interested in fashion history, interested in how... I just lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that? I'm flipping through to see if I could get my memory jogged by maybe seeing what I was looking at that gave me that thought in the first place. Oh dear, oh dear. Oh, if you're interested, that's what it was. I just had to flip through it and find the part accidentally where it's talking about New Testament and Old Testament. Okay, so yeah, if you're also interested in maybe having some things in Bible history that you didn't know about, like things that you didn't necessarily think about, like the guys hiding among the flax. Like none of us really thought about that, right? Like why did she have flax on her roof? We just didn't really think about it. I didn't. And it actually has a story about, like, she actually, if at least for her household, she was trying to get linen out of that, if not for a potential business, like side business. We don't know. But the thing is, it points to a little bit more about Rahab that we wouldn't have thought about. And it points to the history of women during that time period. So it's really cool, really interesting, just from so many perspectives. Highly recommend this book if you have not checked it out. I will at some point read her other book. I own it. It looks maybe a little drier than this one because it seems like it's a lot more focused on the actual fabrics, but I still look forward to reading it. So this is Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years by Elizabeth Wayland Barber, Women, Cloth, and Society in Early Times. Goes culture to culture, era to era. So fascinating. Please do check this out. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope that you enjoyed this video. Hope that you are inspired to give this book a shot. Have a great day, and I will see you for the next video. God bless.
Books keep coming home with me. Piles so tall, they're all I see. Turn a page and sail the sea. Reading always feels so free.